Taptajivanam Kavibididitam Kalmashapaham Shravanamangalam Shrimadatatam Bhuviganantiye Bhuridajanaha. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our class on the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. We are continuing to discuss the entry from October 28th, 1882. Another thing is, I want to give you a heads up on the next two classes, which are going to be held on Tuesday, June 17th at 7:30 p.m., and then Wednesday, June 25th at 7:30 p.m. So we've got three gospel classes in the month of June. Okay, now, I also want to revisit a couple things that we talked about last time, because I think they're important. First of all, here is an important suggestion I would make when you're studying the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna in any language. In English, there's Nikhilanji's The Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. It's quite big. I think it's over 1,000 pages. It's large, 1,062. There's an abridged edition of the same book. Does anyone know about that? Do we sell that here? I don't know. Yeah. It's much smaller, kind of pocket size. And the difference seems to be primarily that it removes repetitions, because Sri Ramakrishna often repeats the same teachings. And what I would suggest is that quite a bit is lost if you remove the repetitions, and that each repetition is significant. Partly because you'll find that Sri Ramakrishna, when he repeats the same story, it's never exactly the same. There might be some details or some variants in one version of the story which are not present in another version of the story. And so to have a proper understanding of the parable or the story, whatever the teaching is, it's really important that we place that teaching in the context of all the other places he gives the same teaching. We have to supplement that teaching with similar teachings elsewhere in the gospel. And one good example of that is the passage that we discussed last time. You remember the metaphor of an infinite ocean of Satchitananda? And he says, think of Brahman, existence, knowledge, bliss, absolute, as a shoreless ocean. Through the cooling influence, as it were, of the bhakta's love, the water has frozen at places into blocks of ice. In other words, God now and then assumes various forms for his lovers and reveals himself to them as a person. But with the rising of the sun of knowledge, the blocks of ice melt. Then one does not feel anymore that God is a person, nor does one see God's forms. Okay. Now, if we take this version of the story to be the definitive one could easily interpret this through the lens of classical Advaita Vedanta, right? Because then these forms of God, these different forms, shapes, ice formations on the ocean, they melt in the end, which means they're not ultimately real. QED, Advaita has proved that Brahman alone is real, everything else is unreal. Even these different forms of the personal God are unreal. But that's why it's so important to look at other teachings of his. For instance, and I mentioned this last time, but I'll just mention it again. March 11th, 1883, so a few months later, he says, he gives the same parable, and then he says, but after this whole paragraph, he says, but you may say that for certain devotees, God assumes eternal forms, nitya-shakar. There are places in the ocean where the ice does not melt at all. It assumes the form of quartz. So what I'm suggesting is, even here, in this instance of the story, it's important to keep in mind that caveat, that in other versions of the story that's about to come, the story continues and specifically highlights the fact that the forms of the personal God are not ultimately negated, that they can also ultimately be real. So that bhakti is not placed on a lower footing than jnana. Okay, that's one example. And I would suggest that this should be a kind of general interpretive principle. Because seeing the different variations in the different tellings of the same teaching and story and parable can help us, help enrich our understanding of what Sri Ramakrishna is actually trying to say. And it'll help prevent misunderstanding what he's saying. Okay. Now, the next thing I wanted to mention, this is again revisiting something that we already read last time, but I skipped over this. And actually, after my last class, a Bengali devotee in India asked me this question. She said, what exactly does Sri Ramakrishna mean by bodhe bodh? Bodhe bodh. Let me repeat the paragraph in which this phrase occurs. Right after the paragraph about the ocean that I just read, Sri Ramakrishna then goes on to explain the process of Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge, where it's a kind of who am I reasoning along the lines of Ramana Maharshi. In that context, he says, in that state, a man no longer finds the existence of his I. And who is there left to seek it? Who can describe how he feels in that state, in his own pure consciousness, about the real nature of Brahman? Once a salt doll went to measure the depth of the ocean. No sooner was it in the water than it melted. Now, who was to tell the depth? And the Bengali here is, যেখানে নিজের আমি খুঁজে পাওয়া যায় না আর খুঁজে বাকে সেখানে ব্রহ্মের স্বরূপ বোধে বোধ কী রূপ হয় কে বলবে বোধে বোধ okay here's the thing you can clearly tell even if you don't know the language that the same word is being used twice bodh or bodha okay. The word Buddha, right, the great Buddha, it comes from the same etymological root, means awakening, enlightenment, consciousness, spiritual consciousness, okay? So bodhe bodh. Now, this, in Bengali, when you add an E at the end of this word, this becomes, it changes the case. I don't want to get into a grammar lesson here, but do we know cases here? Does anyone know what a case is? You don't know any languages with cases like German or Russian? Huh? Case of beer. Okay, all right. It's not for online consumption. And yes, Latin, Greek, these all have cases. The Sanskrit term is vibhakti. And Bengali also, because it's a Sanskritic language, it also has cases. Let me give an example for people who don't know any foreign language and who are just English, lame. All right, so an example of a case in English would be, to whom are you going to give this gift? The whom there is in the accusative case. It's a direct object. So you don't say, of course in casual English we'd say, who are you giving the gift to? But that's actually wrong. It's not who, it should be whom. To whom are you giving the gift? So the M at the end indicates that it is the accusative case, which means it's the direct object, rather than the subject of the sentence. Likewise here, and there in Sanskrit, we have no fewer than 7 or 8 cases, depending on how you're counting. 8 is actually the number, more or less. And this is what's called a locative case. It's like if I say, in Bengali, if I want to say in India, I say Indiate. Indiate, I add a T-E, in India. And here it's bodhe bodh. Bodhe means in bodha. So if you want to be very, very literal, even though it doesn't really make much sense, you would translate this as realization within realization, or something like that, or pure consciousness within consciousness, or something. I mean, it's really tricky. And so this is an important question that this devotee raised. How exactly should we translate this phrase, and how should we understand it? What better person to ask than revered Swami Sarvapriyanji? So I asked him this morning how he understands it. And he suggested the following interpretation. There are other interpretations, so I'm just presenting this as one possibility. He says, look, to honor the phrasing, which is that it's the same word used twice except in different cases. He's saying it could mean realization of Bodha, and by Bodha he means Brahman, or you can say, where's my marker? Brahman. You can say, this is also pure consciousness. Okay. Realization of pure consciousness in Bodha. And here he's saying, even though the same word is used, he's understanding Bodha in the second instance in a slightly different way. And it's a very technical, philosophical Sanskrit word, Brahmakara Vritti. Okay. Now, in classical Advaita Vedanta, Vritti means, this should be familiar to anyone who attends my Yoga Sutra class, right? Because the goal of yoga is Chitta Vritti Nirodha, the elimination of, thought waves, mental fluctuations. Yeah, exactly. So that's what Vritti means. Where did it go again? Why do I keep losing my mark? Oh, okay. Good. So, thought wave, that's good. Okay, so the idea here is, through intense spiritual practice, the practice of the path of knowledge, this very advanced classical Advaita Vedantin eliminates all thought waves, all worldly thought waves, even thought waves of the personal God, and there's only one remaining thought wave, and that is Brahmakara. It's the thought wave in the form of Akara, Brahman itself. The thought only of non-dual pure consciousness and nothing else. Okay, now you might say, well, how can that be the final goal? It's still operating at the level of mind. There still seems to be some form of subject-object duality. And so what Sarvapyanji suggests is, this is my understanding of what Maharaj told me. He says, yeah, there is a further stage here. And that's how he takes the subsequent sentences in the same paragraph. After Sri Ramakrishna says, I'm reading Nikalanji's translation, which is not the same, but who can describe how he feels in that state, in his own pure consciousness? So Nikalanji renders it as in his own pure consciousness, about the real nature of Brahman. Then he says, once a salt doll went to measure the depth of the ocean. No sooner was it in the water than it melted. Now who was to tell the depth? So what Sarvapyanji is suggesting is, after this stage of Bodhe Bodh, the next stage is the salt doll melting into the infinite ocean. It's the total merging of the individual soul or individuality in non-dual pure consciousness, where there's not even a trace of subject-object duality left. So if you are thinking of the yoga or samadhi-oriented kind of Advaita Vedanta, this would be the state of nirvikalpa samadhi. Sri Ramakrishna himself often describes the state of nirvikalpa samadhi using this metaphor of a salt doll going to measure the depth of the ocean and melting in the ocean. So in that case, when you're in the state of nirvikalpa samadhi, this is such a radical state of non-duality, there's no question of any kind of thought wave. You've transcended mind. And in fact, you end up leaving the body. After a certain amount of time, he typically says within 21 days, for lack of food. And because you've completely lost external consciousness. Okay. And so this is Sarvapyanji's interpretation, which is quite interesting. And I want to just raise it as a question and encourage you to make your own suggestions in the YouTube comments as to how you might interpret this phrase, Bodhe Bodh. I don't have any strong opinion about this. I'm still thinking about it. But one other possibility is that it seems to me that, especially because the salt doll example comes right after he brings up this phrase, that it may be not entirely plausible to distinguish them as different stages. And so my question is there a way to interpret Bodhe Bodh more in terms of the salt doll, as a kind of radical non-dual experience, rather than as a stage, the penultimate stage leading up to that radical non-duality? And one way I was thinking about it is, Bodhe Bodh, it would be like pure consciousness within consciousness, or something like that. So there's nothing but consciousness. And part of the reason why Sri Ramakrishna is using this somewhat cryptic expression is because the whole point of the context of the paragraph is the I doesn't exist anymore, right? So there's no I realizing pure consciousness, because even that formula or that formulation, that expression, implies or presupposes some form of subject-object duality, right? I am realizing pure consciousness, or I am realizing my true nature. There's no I. If there's no I, the only term we can use is pure consciousness. And so he's saying it's like pure consciousness or realization of pure consciousness within pure consciousness, or something like that. So that would be another interpretation. And maybe there's a third, fourth, fifth, sixth interpretation. And so I encourage you to venture your speculations about how you think the phrase Bodha Bodh should be translated. Okay, so now with all that said, let us continue this entry from October 28th, 1882, and this is page 148 of Nikhilanandaji's translation. Okay, he says, there is a sign of perfect knowledge, Purna Jnana. Man becomes silent when it is attained. Then the I, which may be likened to the salt doll, melts in the ocean of existence, knowledge, bliss. Oh, existence, knowledge, bliss, absolute, and becomes one with it. Not the slightest trace of distinction is left. Then he says, and this is a paragraph I want to focus on it after reading it. As long as his self-analysis is not complete, man argues with much ado, but he becomes silent when he completes it. When the empty pitcher has been filled with water, when the water inside the pitcher becomes one with the water of the lake outside, no more sound is heard. Sound comes from the pitcher as long as the pitcher is not filled with water. Let's pause here. Or actually, let me read one more sentence. People used to say in olden days that no boat returns after having once entered the black waters of the ocean. Okay. Yeah. Does the mic work? Okay.
So what I'm wondering is that they talk about, so the salt doll doesn't return. The Jivan Mukti merges with the Brahman and he can't come back.
Well, he's not a Jivan Mukta then if he can't come back.
Okay. Well, he merges and he can't come back.
Yeah, right.
So what?
He would be a Videha Mukta.
It seems like there's also the possibility of like the seven sages whom, Thakur went up in
right.
that state of meditation to these seven stages.
The realm of seven sages.
Yeah. And talked to one of them and encouraged him to come down, and it turned out to be Vivekananda. So does that mean those sages haven't attained that state where they merge into Nirvikalpa Samadhi? I mean, it seems like sort of contradictory, and I'm just wondering how you can resolve this
sure.
kind of
Great
thought.
question, and this is another reason why it's so important to look at his teachings together rather than in isolation, because one of the teachings that's crucial that he mentions in many other places is a distinction between two classes of soul, Jivakoti and Ishvarakoti. Okay? Jivakoti are ordinary souls who come to this earth because of their own karma, because of their karmic bondage. They're forced to come back because of their own karma. That's us, right? Ishvarakotis are divinely commissioned souls, and he defines Ishvarakoti as incarnations and those who are born as parts of an incarnation. Avatar ba avatarer angsho. Okay. He says those people, and then he uses the example of the staircase and the roof. He says, imagine you want to get to the roof. You have to climb up the staircase, leave the steps behind one by one. He likens that to the process of neti. Not this, not this. Very much like this Jnana Yoga process. Brahman is not this world. Brahman is not my body. Brahman is not my mind. Until you reach the roof. That's Nirvikalpa Samadhi. That's this radical, non-dual, salt doll, merging in the ocean kind of realization. That's called Jnana. And then he says, Jivakotis, once they reach the roof, once they attain that state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi, will leave their body within 21 days. They're not going to come back as Jivan Muktas. Okay. But, he says, if that person is an Ishvara Koti, after reaching the roof, they'll turn back on the staircase and say, wait a minute, but the stairs are made of the same material as the roof, bricks, lime, and brick dust. And then that Ishvara Koti can come back to this world. And you might ask, why? Not out of imperfection. They're not even here for karmic reasons, but to help others, to serve others out of spiritual compassion. That's the idea. And so he himself, for instance, Ramakrishna himself, came out of the state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi because Divine Mother said, remain in Bhavamukha, Bhavamukha Thakur. That's the state of Vijnana, basically. And he did it not for himself, not because he had to, but to help humanity. That's the idea. Okay, now, with regard to this pitcher metaphor, I think a pretty obvious question/objection arises. Can you think of any? He's describing two states of the pitcher, right? When the empty pitcher has been filled with water, when the water inside the pitcher becomes one with the water of the lake outside, no more sound is heard. Sound comes from the pitcher as long as the pitcher is not filled with water. Okay, so long as the pitcher is not full of water, so when you're pouring into that pitcher, it's going to make noise, right? And then the second state is it's a completely full pitcher. In that case, it won't make noise anymore. It won't make that gurgling sound. What are these two states, first of all? What is the quarter full pitcher? What does that signify? He explains it in the previous sentence. As long as his self-analysis is not complete, man argues with much ado, but he becomes silent when he completes it. So what is this quarter full or half full pitcher? A spiritual aspirant who has not yet realized the highest truth, probably, who is still engaged in spiritual practice, but has not attained the goal of his or her spiritual practice. Right. And what does this second condition of the pitcher correspond to, which is the completely full pitcher, which no longer makes any noise? Or the realized soul, maybe. Yeah, right. And I think that person can be either Jivan Mukta or Videha Mukta. Jivan Mukta means you're still living in a physical body. Videha Mukta means you get realization and then you leave the physical body. And in either case, it doesn't make any sound anymore. Why? Because either you're a Jivan Mukta and you're not speaking anymore, you're silent, or you leave the body and unless you're a ghost, you're not talking, right? Okay. But there's an obvious question here, I think. Can you think of any or no? What about Ramakrishna himself? What category does he fall into? Is he the quarter full pitcher or the fully full pitcher? Obviously the fully full pitcher. And yet, was he quiet? No, otherwise we wouldn't have a 1,000-page gospel. He's constantly talking. Huh? What's the other analogy? Wow, you were almost there. What? Yeah, well, why don't you get her the mic? Well, you just flash it. You give it to her. Mm-hmm. Okay, what's happening here? Okay, say it. Just take the mic.
His other analogy.
What's the other analogy? You don't know what the other analogy is. Okay.
He's basically like the Ishvara Koti that you just mentioned.
Yeah, that's right. I think that's right. Yeah, both of you said the same thing, which is, Ramakrishna, Shankara, these great souls are Ishvara Kotis, and so even though they are realized, they are not quiet because they're speaking to others, teaching others in order to help them, right? Well, that's why we need a third state of the pitcher.
Is it where the pitcher's then filling up
someone
else, another vessel?
She knows the gospel well. Thank you, because I'm going to read exactly that passage. Very well done. Okay, so this is another example of this interpretive principle that I'm encouraging all of you to employ, which is, don't read the abridged edition of the gospel, read the unabridged edition of the gospel, because each repetition of the same teaching is extremely important, because there are slight variations across these teachings. And in this case too, this pitcher teaching is incomplete by itself, because it only mentions two states of the pitcher, either semi-full or fully full. And in another place, from the entry dated August 5th, 1882, so a few months prior, A devotee asks, suppose a person has obtained the knowledge of Brahman and Samadhi. Doesn't he speak anymore? Sri Ramakrishna. Shankaracharya retained the ego of knowledge, Biddarami, the eye of knowledge, in order to teach others. After the vision of Brahman, a man becomes silent. He reasons about it as long as he has not realized it. If you heat butter in a pan on the stove, it makes a sizzling sound as long as the water it contains is not dried up. But when no trace of water is left, the clarified butter makes no sound. If you put an uncooked cake of flour in that butter, it sizzles again. But after the cake is cooked, all sound stops. Just so, a person established in samadhi comes down to the relative plane of consciousness in order to teach others, and then he talks about God. The bee buzzes as long as it is not sitting on a flower. It becomes silent when it begins to sip the honey. But sometimes, intoxicated with the honey, it buzzes again. An empty pitcher makes a gurgling sound when it is dipped in water. That's the semi-full or partially full pitcher. When it fills up, it becomes silent. That's the second state of the pitcher, fully full. All laugh. But if the water is poured from it into another pitcher, then you will hear the sound again, laughter. That third state of the pitcher is very important. If we just take this to be the definitive teaching on the pitchers, he's leaving out Ishvarakotis, and he's leaving out, ironically, himself and the greatest spiritual personages, the avatars, those who come back from the state of samadhi in order to teach others and instruct others, okay? So I hope I've made a strong case for why we need to read these teachings in the context of other places where the same teaching occurs, because there are slight variations. And also link these teachings, make sure that however you interpret that teaching, it needs to gel with all of his other teachings, right? That's another important principle that we should keep in mind. You can't just cherry pick teachings and say, this is Ramakrishna's view, and then ignore all the other teachings. Okay, you have to explain how all of these teachings cohere and how they all make sense together. All right. Okay, with all that said, another thing I would say is, there's another metaphor of Sri Ramakrishna's that I think is helpful here. I milk it a lot. For reasons that'll be obvious to people who know me. Ramakrishna says, to kill yourself, you only need like a nail cutter, an Indian style, like 19th century nail cutter is something that's kind of like sharp and you can kill yourself with it by just poking right there. And then he says, but to kill others, you need a sword and a shield. To kill others, you need a sword and a shield. If I want to kill you, I'm not going to, just using that nail cutters now, you'll just run away or you'll smack it out of my hand, right? But if I have a sword and a shield, I'll defend myself and I can kill you, right? Okay. And what does he use that analogy for? Well, the idea is, if you only are striving for your own liberation, just practice the path that is best suited for you and then call it a day. Once you attain realization, you're done, right? But there are greater souls who have a greater mission in life. And it could be to teach others like these Ishvarakotis, or it could be to dialogue with others. Like, if you go to an interfaith meeting, I go to a lot of academic conferences and things like that where I'm constantly arguing and debating with other academics who have completely different standpoints. They're atheist or agnostic or Christian or Muslim. And I'm this Hindu sitting here. And just because I have faith in the Hindu faith, and I'm happy with my beliefs and my Ishtadevata and this and that, that's not going to convince the atheist or the skeptic or the agnostic. So I need the sword and the shield, right? And so I don't need to trot out these arguments to convince myself. I may, but they're not necessary. But you often have to say a lot more and different kinds of things in order to convince others. So I think that's a related point to the one about the Ishvarakoti coming back to teach others. Okay, now let's continue. Sri Ramakrishna says, all trouble and botheration come to an end when the I dies. And in fact, right after this, even though Nikhilanji doesn't mention it, laughter, it says laughter. He's a very funny guy. Okay, you may indulge in thousands of reasonings, but still the I does not disappear. For people like you and me, it is good to have the feeling, I am a lover of God. Then he says, the Saguna Brahman is meant for the bhaktas. In other words, a bhakta believes that God has attributes and reveals himself to men as a person, assuming forms. It is he who listens to our prayers. The prayers that you utter are directed to him alone. Always replace he with she and all that as usual, same caveats. You are bhaktas, not jnanis or Vedantas. It doesn't matter whether you accept God with form or not. It is enough to feel that God is a person, capital P, who listens to our prayers, who creates, preserves, and destroys the universe, and who is endowed with infinite power. Okay, so a few things here. This is what I just read to you is the beginning of a new section. And that section is called Ami Kintu Jaina. The I, however, doesn't disappear entirely. Something like that. Okay, that's the name of this little section. It's just like two, 3 paragraphs. Sri Ramakrishna is kind of capturing the essence of spiritual life. Ami mole ghuchibe janjal. It means all troubles cease when the I dies. All of our suffering, all of our problems stem from ego. And one way of thinking about spiritual practice, the aim of spiritual practice, is to kill ego. If you've eliminated ego, you don't need to do anything else. You've ipso facto realized the highest. But here's the catch. It's extraordinarily difficult to kill the ego, to kill the I altogether. And he says the path of knowledge, in a certain sense, requires you to do that through self-inquiry, right? This is the Ramana Maharshi approach. And Ramakrishna will say, go on asking yourself, who am I? Who am I? I'm not the body. I'm not the mind. What should result in that self-inquiry? You should finally reach a point where you have no sense of I whatsoever. There's just pure consciousness. No ego remains. But what do we find happening? Advaita is a very popular philosophy now. There's a whole movement called Neo-Advaita. And I've had some experiences with some Neo-Advaitans, and most of them are not they're not free from ego. Let me put it that way. It's ironic, but it's also a fact that many so-called Advaitans can be very egoistic about Advaita, about non-duality, and priding themselves on the fact that they are non-dualists and looking down on the bhaktas and saying, oh, you bhaktas, you poor bhaktas, maybe someday you'll come up to my level. And so Ramakrishna recognized the danger of the path of knowledge, the path of non-duality. I think so, because he mentions it in many places. Most other places, what he says is, you are not fit to practice the path of knowledge so long as you have any trace of body consciousness. That's the way he would usually put it. So long as you identify with the physical body, you are not eligible to practice the path of knowledge. And if you do, you will end up deceiving yourself and deceiving others. And here, the formulation is slightly different. It's the same message, but instead of saying, so long as you're identified with the body, he's saying, so long as you have any I consciousness, any sense of ego, any sense of I. And he's saying it's extraordinarily difficult to completely eliminate the sense of I. And he says there's an easier and just frankly more pleasant path. What is that? The path of bhakti. Why? Because the path of bhakti doesn't require us to eliminate the I. It says transform the I. Transform the rascal ego, the selfish I attached to lust and greed, into the I of a devotee, bhaktirami. Think of yourself as a child of God, as a spark of the divine. Much easier than trying to eliminate the I, which is almost like kind of chasing your own tail, right? And then he makes a really interesting point. I did talk about this a long time ago, but I'm going to mention it again. Whom is he addressing? Brahma Samaj followers. Followers of the Brahma Samaj, they didn't believe in God with form, any kind of form. Whether it's incarnations or whether it's like forms like Kali or Ganesha, they didn't believe in any of them. They believed in the formless but personal God. So again, it would be, they believed in Saguna, personal God, but without form. Nirakara, Saguna, Brahman. And Sri Ramakrishna, this is a passage which clearly illustrates that he was fully aware of the distinction among these four terms. He's not equating nirakara with nirguna, and he's not equating sakara with saguna. He recognizes, and he points out to the Brahma Samaj followers, you guys are bhaktas, you believe in the personal God, saguna Brahman, even though you believe in the formless God, nirakara. Because the personal God can either have form, but the personal God can also be formless. I just gave a talk in Trabuco on the Peace Pilgrim, this great American saint. And as far as I can tell, she believed in the formless but personal God as well. Islam believes in the formless but personal God. Sikhism believes in the formless but personal God. So there are many religions that believe in that. Okay. And Hinduism, very broadly, accepts all of these different conceptions of the divine, formless, but with form also, and personal and impersonal. But another caveat, which I mentioned last time, but I'm going to mention again, because it's another kind of one of these interpretive principles that we have to keep in mind. Sri Ramakrishna uses the term nirakara in two different senses, depending on the context in which he's speaking. Okay, in this paragraph, the context is Brahma Samaj, right? And it's very clear from what he's saying that he's thinking of the formless but personal God. In other contexts, and specifically in the context of classical Advaita Vedanta, when he's talking about non-dual philosophy, Shankara's school, he often uses the term nirakara there too. We're going to find that in a second. I'll mention it later. We have to get to Kabir eventually. There, what he means by nirakara is nirakara nirguna. So I should write this because this is a really important point, because a lot of people get confused about this. So, nirakara, formless, can mean one is, it could be, and nirguna, and the second would be saguna. Okay, so nirakara nirguna would be Advaita Vedanta, classical Advaita Vedanta, and nirakara saguna would be Brahma Samaj, BS, Islam, and so on. Okay. Peace Pilgrim, I think. Okay. And then he says, it is enough to feel that God is a person who listens to our prayers, who creates, preserves, and destroys the universe, and who is endowed with infinite power. What is the word for person here with the capital P? The word in Bangla is Bhakti, Vyakti. Vyakti, it just literally means person, like I'm a Vyakti and you're also a Vyakti. Okay. But what does it mean for God to be a person with a capital P? He defines it very precisely here. He doesn't say you need to have two arms and two eyes and have a mouth to talk with. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. He says, it is enough to feel that God is a person who listens to our prayers. You don't need ears, though. That's important to keep in mind. The formless God can hear our prayers without ears. Okay. Who creates, preserves, and destroys the universe. And again, this is God without form, though. God can create without having a form. That's the beauty of being an omnipotent God. You don't need arms to construct things. And who is endowed with infinite power. You can be omnipotent without having a form, right? And so it's important to keep in mind here, when Sri Ramakrishna is saying that God is a person, he doesn't mean an incarnation. Okay? Because Brahma Samaj doesn't accept incarnations, because that's another form of God, right? But they do believe that God is a supreme person in the sense that he defines it. Creator of this world, listens to our prayers, can answer our prayers, and so on. Loves us. So only a person can, unless God is a person, God can't relate to us, as a loving being, as a parent, right? Okay, so that's also important. And then he says, it is easier to attain God by following the path of devotion. This is another one of his keynotes. This is a keynote that you find throughout the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. He says there are many paths to God. The path of knowledge is another one of them. But it's very difficult. And I like to think about it this way. It's my own quaint metaphor, but I'm adapting one of his own metaphors for my purposes. You want to reach the roof of a house. Okay, there's a staircase, there's an elevator, and there's a rope. Now, let's just stipulate that in a group of 10 people, only one has sufficient upper body strength and stamina to climb up that rope and reach the roof. And even that person, it still takes that person, let's say 20 seconds to climb up that rope. And then there's another person, well, no, not another person. Who can take the elevator? Anybody. And the staircase, anybody who's not on a wheelchair, right? But literally anybody can take the elevator. That elevator is bhakti. The rope, Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge. Now the thing about this rope is, what if I'm one of those 9 out of 10 who doesn't have sufficient upper body strength, but is a little cocky and a little overconfident, and I think to myself, hey, that guy, if that guy can do it, why can't I? It just looks so easy. And I get up there, and I'm not bad, and so I'm like halfway up. And now I'm looking down and freaking out, and I'm also losing strength. And then I start losing my grip. And then instead of reaching the roof, I fall and die. Sorry. Okay. So that's the danger of the path of knowledge. If you're not qualified, but you mistakenly think you are, or you deceive yourself or deceive other people into thinking that you are, you can fall flat on your face, and it could result in spiritual ruin, spiritual death. You have to start all over again, come back again in another body, do it again, right? And look, the elevator, how long does it take anyone, any of those 10 people, to take the elevator up to the roof? Let's say 10 seconds. Why not? It doesn't mean that bhakti is a slower path. Just because it's accessible to everybody doesn't make it worse. Some people think that. The harder path must be the faster one, the better one, the superior one. Wrong. It's not true. Right? So I think that's why this metaphor, I think, is pretty useful. You take the elevator, no harm. Don't worry, this is not the kind of elevator that can get stuck. It's a divine elevator. By divine grace, you'll never get stuck. That is a terrifying nightmare, to be stuck in an elevator. Where are you going to go to the bathroom? I know. Okay, so, okay. Now, let's move on. We got to get to Kabir eventually. So here we go. Pancham Parichhed. This is the beginning of a new chapter, chapter 5. In the Bengali, of course, it just continues in the English. And M gives an epigraph again from his favorite text, the Gita, Bhagavad Gita, this time chapter 11, verse 54, 11.54. Bhaktya tvananyaya shakya ahamevam vidojana gyatum drashtum cha tatvena praveshtum cha parantapa. Through unwavering bhakti, one is capable of knowing me and then seeing me and finally entering into me, into my essence. Okay, something like that. I'm just paraphrasing. That's the epigraph which kind of anticipates what's going to be the main theme of the section. It'll involve bhakti, and it'll also involve realization, direct spiritual realization of the divine. And now, he says, or he doesn't say, a Brahmo devotee asks, Sir, is it possible for one to see God? If so, why can't we see him? Master, yes, he can surely be seen. One can see his forms and his formless aspect as well. How can I explain that to you? Let's pause here briefly, because something strikes me as sounding a little odd. Sri Ramakrishna says, "Hein, obosho dekha jay, shakar roop dekha jay, abar orupo dekha jay." He's literally saying in Bengali that yes, of course God can be seen. Both God with form, shakar roop, abar orupo dekha jay, and God without form. What does it mean? What does it mean to see God without form? To see the formless God? Because by definition, presumably, a formless God would be one that doesn't have a visible form. And so maybe that's why he says in the very next sentence, "Ta tomai bujabo kemon kore, bujabo kemon kore," which means, how can I explain that to you? So it might be some kind of mystical realization which is impossible to explain or to rationally grasp. I'm not sure. Maybe other people, if any of you have thoughts about this. But what does it mean? But I was thinking one possibility here, because it was, Peace Pilgrim is fresh in my mind. Even though I think that she worships God as formless but personal, at the same time, she's always talking about how the divine manifests in nature, for instance. And she sees God speaking to her, manifesting in the trees and in other people and so on. And I wonder whether that's one way to think about how one can see the formless aspect of God. You might say, well, those are forms in a certain sense, the trees and whatever. But that's not exactly the form in the sense that Kali is a form or that an incarnation is a form. The formless divine is permeating everything, something like that.
Maybe you could see the light,
Yeah, that's also possible, yeah.
the formless light.
Yeah, that's a good suggestion. Maybe it's a formless light, because he does, when he talks about formless meditations, that's one of the meditations he recommends, which is imagine a light that just keeps expanding, for instance. Right, so that's another possibility. And also, like sometimes gurus in our tradition, when they tell us to meditate on the formless absolute or the formless divine, they'll say you can meditate on an infinite ocean, like Ramakrishna's Satchitananda ocean. And imagine that, you're swimming in that ocean or something like that. Something infinite and vast. There's still a form, but it's a form of the formless or something, or a form representing formlessness, or something like that. Okay, so that's a good suggestion. Anyway, that's kind of an open question. I don't think there's an obvious answer. And maybe it requires mystical experience to really understand what he means by that. But let's continue. Then the Brahmo devotee asks, what are the means by which one can see God? Sri Ramakrishna says, can you weep for God with intense longing of heart? People shed a jug full of tears for the sake of their children, for their wives, or for money. But who weeps for God? So long as a child remains engrossed with its toys, the mother looks after her cooking and other household duties. But when the child no longer relishes the toys, it throws them aside and yells for its mother. Then the mother takes the rice pot down from the hearth, runs in haste, and takes the child in her arms. So in short, Ramakrishna's answer to the Brahma's question, what are the means by which one can see God, is the answer seems to be, you really need to want God. You really sincerely have to want God and God alone. And the moment you feel that, you'll be able to realize God. It's a remarkable answer. And he gives this beautiful example. Vast majority of human beings are crying for everything and anything but God. If you can cry for God instead of these worldly things and people and all that and your loved ones, then you'll be able to realize God. And so some other analogies he uses are like, God is a huge magnet, and the soul is like a needle, which is inherently attracted to the magnet. Then why don't I feel attracted to God? Because there are these layers of mud and dirt caked over that needle, preventing that innate attraction from manifesting. So what's the purpose of spiritual practice? To remove the mud. Take a hose, remove those layers of mud. What happens when you do? Automatically, the needle will fly to the magnet realization, right? So that's what we need. In a certain sense, the aim of all spiritual practice is to generate that intense longing for the divine, intense longing for realization. Okay. This is also why I should mention again a plug for music, because it's one of the most powerful functions of music, of spiritual music, is that it generates this longing. Because most spiritual music is just nothing but longing, right? It's the singer's longing for the divine. Often that's why songs are prayers to God, and some of my favorite ones are. And so by listening carefully to a song by singing a song with the right attitude, so not trying to show off and get applause and recognition and all that, or a record deal. But if it should be between you and God, then what happens? That singing itself becomes a spiritual practice. And it can help you to generate that longing, which is the prelude to realization. Okay. Brahmo devotee. This is some smart devotee. I wonder who it is. Anyway, keep asking these tough questions. Sir, why are there so many different opinions about the nature of God? Some say that God has form, while others say that he is formless. Again, those who speak of God with form tell us about his different forms. Why all this controversy? Master, a devotee thinks of God as he sees God. In reality, there is no confusion about God. God explains all this to the devotee if the devotee only realizes God somehow. You haven't set your foot in that direction. How can you expect to know all about God? Okay, pause again. I'm going to have to give you a little fair warning here because it's 8:21. This may be another class where I keep promising to talk about Kabir, and I may not get to Kabir. But we will have a class next week, and so in case we don't get to Kabir this time again, I'll change the title on YouTube, and then we'll get to Kabir next time. But I don't want to rush. Key here is patience, and I feel like there's no rush. So, okay, let's look at this. A devotee thinks of God as he sees God. This is very interesting. The question was, why do people argue with each other about the nature of God? Not just argue, they kill each other over God in the name of God. Why? And then Ramakrishna's answer seems very simple. A devotee thinks of God as he sees him. Each of us thinks of God in the way that we like to think of God, right? As he sees him, this is also really interesting. See, philosophically speaking, there are different theories of mystical experience, realization, spiritual experience. One of them is called constructivism, and this is the idea, they can agree with what Ramakrishna is saying here. A devotee thinks of God as he sees him. Yeah. Constructivists will say, exactly, that's our position. And they'll say, see, so all forms of God are subjective projections. They're kind of hallucinations. We're projecting onto an ultimate reality something that's not real. It's like a subjective projection. Is that Ramakrishna's view? No, you're vigorously shaking your head. So tell us what you think his view is in opposition to constructivism. Yes, can you give the mic to her?
Because Ramakrishna doesn't describe it as like a person's projection of what they want. He describes it as God coming to the form of, coming as in the form that the devotee wants, like a mother. Oh, maybe that's different than the mother cooking.
No, you're on fire today, Katyayani.
Okay.
Well done. Because you're anticipating something he says on the next page. God reveals herself in the form which her devotee loves most, right? That's what you have in mind, right? This is what I call, in chapter 5 of my book, Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality, manifestationism. And I argue that Sri Ramakrishna was a manifestationist about mystical experience and not a constructivist, which means what? When a Christian mystic realizes God as God the Father or as Christ or as Mary, these are not hallucinations, these are not subjective projections onto some impersonal truth or something like that. No, they're real. The one infinite divine lovingly manifests to the Christian mystic as Mother Mary or as Christ. The same infinite divine lovingly manifests to the Muslim, the Sufi mystic, for instance, as Allah. The same infinite divine lovingly manifests to the Vaishnava as Krishna, and so on and so forth. The Shakta as Kali, right? So there's no question of the form being a subjective projection. God loves us, and the term is Bhakta Vatsala, which means God is a lover of her devotees. And it's out of love that she's going to manifest to us in the form that we love most, that we like to think of God in. Okay? Good, very good. But he says something else, which is, I think, raises a question. He says, in reality, there is no confusion about God. God explains all this to the devotee if the devotee only realizes God somehow. This is interesting, because there are different ways to interpret this. Is he saying, here's a question for you, is Sri Ramakrishna saying anyone who realizes God will not argue with anyone else about the nature of God. The moment you realize God, you'll recognize that all spiritual aspirants and all religious traditions and all spiritual paths and all realized souls are all experiencing different forms and aspects of the same infinite divine. Is that what he's saying? The sentence, well, let me read the paragraph, the context of the book. So he says, a devotee thinks of God as he sees God. In reality, there is no confusion about God. Remember, the question was, why do people fight about God? God explains all this to the devotee if the devotee only realizes him somehow, or her. I always say her. And let me read the Bengali because that might shed light. He says, তাঁকে কোনো রকমে যদি একবার লাভ করতে পারা যায় তাহলে তিনি সব বুঝিয়ে দেন. So Nikhilanji's translation here is quite faithful. All that Sri Ramakrishna seems to be saying is, if you just somehow attain realization of God, then God herself will explain everything to you. So now my question about this statement is it plausible to interpret this to mean that anybody who realizes God will recognize that there's one infinite divine who lovingly manifests to different people in different forms, and therefore all religions and spiritual paths are different paths to the same goal? Yeah, it sounds like I'm setting it up just to shoot it down.
Well, if you're a really staunch Krishna devotee, you'll see Krishna, God as Krishna, and you won't be thinking that other people, you won't have a broad view. You'll just be limited in your scope of understanding.
Right. Even the realized soul, the realized, the Vaishnava, who's extremely sincere, very deep in his or her practice, and as a result, and by God's grace, realizes Krishna. Even that realized soul, that realized Vaishnava may still be pretty sectarian and a little dogmatic about God being Krishna alone, or our Krishna is higher and better than your Kali or your Christ. Right? And Ramakrishna says this in another place. He says that people they tend to limit God to what they realize of God. And so there's a parable of a blind man and the elephant, which all of you know. Each one is touching a different part of the same elephant. So touching could signify, it's a direct experience of a certain sort, but they're not experiencing the whole elephant. They're blind, first of all, so it's a different sense, which is touch. But they're only touching one part of this vast animal. And so even realized souls may only have a partial realization. And to support this idea, I think that the parable he's about to use actually supports that. So let me read the parable, and then we can talk about it, and I'll explain how it's relevant. He says, listen to a story. Once a person entered a wood and saw a small animal on a tree. He came back and told another man that he had seen a creature of a beautiful red color on a certain tree. The second person replied, when I went into the wood, I also saw that animal. But why do you call it red? It is green. Another man who was present contradicted them both and insisted that it was yellow. Presently, others arrived and contended that it was gray, violet, blue, and so forth and so on. At last, they started quarreling among themselves. To settle the dispute, they all went to the tree. They saw a person sitting under the tree. On being asked, he replied, yes, I live under this tree, and I know the animal very well. All your descriptions are true. Sometimes it appears red, sometimes yellow, and at other times blue, violet, gray, and so forth. It is a chameleon. And sometimes it has no color at all. Now it has a color, and now it has none. In like manner, one who constantly thinks of God can know God's real nature. That person alone knows that God reveals herself to seekers in various forms and aspects. God has attributes, then again, God has none. Only the person who lives under the tree knows that the chameleon can appear in various colors, and he knows further that the animal at times has no color at all. It is the others who suffer from the agony of futile argument. Who is this? Okay, so now, how might, I don't want to give you everything, so let's see, I want you to use your noggins here. Does this parable of the chameleon help us to elucidate what he means when he says, God explains all this to the devotee if the devotee only realizes God somehow? How might it, if at all? in light of the question I asked, which is, he seems to be making a generalization that anybody who's realized God won't dispute about the nature of God. Yeah, exactly. Very good. Yeah, exactly. The chameleon parable, there's a special person who lives under the tree who sees the chameleon as yellow sometimes, as red other times, blue other times, colorless at other times. Who is that person? Who is this? Who does that man sitting on the tree represent? Sorry, Jnana. Almost. There we go. Yes, exactly. Vijnana. We just had to add a VI to it, and you get Vijnana. The Vijnani.
What is Vijnani again?
The Vijnani is the one who realizes the divine in multiple forms and aspects, as both saguna, personal, and nirguna, impersonal. Both with form, sakara, and without form, nirakara. Okay? And so what you said, jnana, if we're using Sri Ramakrishna's own terminology, by jnana, he means the person who has realized only the nirakara nirguna. So classical Advaita Vedantins, who are like the salt doll melting in the ocean. But they don't accept the reality of Saguna Brahman anymore. Whereas the Vijnani, after reaching the roof, after attaining Samadhi, this Nirvikalpa Samadhi, they come back and say, wait a minute, but that non-dual pure consciousness is also Shakti. Brahman and Shakti are non-different. And that Shakti, Divine Mother, playfully manifests as everything in the world. So that's the Vijnani. Okay. And so I think that, as you're suggesting, this chameleon parable helps to explain, clarify this statement. He doesn't mean any realized soul. He means a Vijnani. He means, in the blind man in the elephant parable, who is that Vijnani again? Kind of obvious. Anyone? Yeah? Who would be the Vijnani in the blind man and the elephant parable? You really are on fire today. Right before she goes home. Okay, so yes, exactly. The one who's not blind, who can see the whole elephant, because it's that person who intervenes and says, hey, you fools. I may not say that, that's not nice. He'll say, stop your quarreling, because you're all touching the same elephant, because I can see the whole elephant, because this is the only person with vision, right? So the Vijnani has a more expansive knowledge of the divine reality than even other realized souls. At the same time, both the chameleon parable and the blind man and the elephant parable have a certain limitation. We should be careful about how far to push these analogies, these parables. I think it would be a serious mistake to think that what Sri Ramakrishna is saying is that the Vijnani has a total knowledge of the divine. Is that what you're going to say?
I was going to say it's kind of putting the Vijnani above.
Well, it's putting it above in a certain sense. I mean, you can say that, look, it's like this. I would say, put it this way. The Vijnani is not above, but he has a broader understanding of the truth than other people. And it would be like saying, somebody who's lived their entire life in the U.S. and another person who's grew up in the U.S. but then lived in India for 13 years, like I did, and who lived in Europe for 2 years, like I did. And so that person he's experienced 3 continents. Is he better than you? Yeah. No, I'm joking. But he's not. No. He's not better. He's not better, but he has a wider knowledge. He has a broader understanding of this earth. I'm on fire. Okay. So, where was I? Okay. So yes, I mean, I see your concern, which is that, see,
That what you were
what?
getting at? That's the danger of.
No. Well, no, I mean, it's related, but it's not the same thing. Here's the thing. Again, that interpretive principle, never cherry pick teachings or take them in isolation. I think this parable of the chameleon, the parable of the blind man and elephant, need to be supplemented with and counterbalanced by another one of his parables, one of my favorites, about an ant. What's the ant parable?
The ant that thinks it can take.
Look at this. Give her the mic. Give this woman a mic. She deserves it.
The ant that takes a little bit of sugar and then says, oh, I'm going to come back and take the whole mountain of sugar next time.
He says nobody can realize the whole of the infinite God. It's not possible. That's the definition of infinitude, is that there's always something beyond what we know, right? That's why Sri Ramakrishna will say about the divine, there is no limit to God. You can never place a limit and say, now I've known the entirety of God. Yeah. Can you give the mic to Natalie?
So you're saying it's kind of like the person under the tree thinking that they know all the colors and
well, no,
all the
okay. So
capacities
you're asking how it's relating to. No,
Yeah.
I'm not saying that. Therefore, the person sitting on the tree is arrogant or something or foolish like the ant. No, the idea is that what I think Sri Ramakrishna is saying through these parables of the chameleon and the elephant, the blind man and the elephant, is some people, some special realized souls, divinely commissioned souls, Vijnanis, namely Vijnanis, realize God in multiple forms and aspects, which is a broader knowledge of God, but not a total knowledge of God. That's it. Does that make sense? And so that's where the analogy kind of breaks down. It's like we shouldn't push it too far. We shouldn't think that the person sitting on the tree has a total knowledge. Yeah, even though you could, right? I mean, the metaphor lends itself to that in a way. I'm saying that would be a mistake. And why would that be a mistake? Because it's impossible to reconcile that with what he says elsewhere about the ant, which he says in many other ways as well, right? He says to touch the Ganga, you don't need to run your finger from its source all the way down to where it ends. No, you touch it anywhere, you've touched the Ganga. So same kind of idea, right? He says to get drunk, you don't need to drink every bottle of liquor in the liquor store. You just need to drink enough for you to get drunk, right? So just realize God in any form or aspect, that's enough. Now, Vijnani realizes God in multiple forms or aspects. I say multiple, but not all. Okay? All this, keep this in mind. So yes, it does turn out that we're not going to quite visit Kabir yet. Meeting is postponed yet again to next week. It's good because it's in this day and age. We need some suspense and like a Netflix, stay tuned for next week. We will start with Kabir, I promise. I'm going to read it to you right now just so that you believe me. Kabir used to say, the formless absolute is my father and God with form is my mother. Wonderful little statement of Sri Ramakrishna. There's a lot to talk about there. Why don't you think about that? And we'll get to that next, what did I say next week? Next Tuesday, the 17th, is our next class. Be here or be square. Thank you. Or do you have any questions? Online questions? We're good? Okay. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu. All right.